According to classical tradition, a swan remains silent all its life until the moment of its death, when it lets out a single final beautiful sound before dying. Which leads us to a rather fascinating subject. How do composers deal with getting old? Take these two very different cases. On the one hand, we have Rossini, who laboured for close to 20 years, writing some 39 operas in that time, then abruptly retired at the astonishingly young age of 37, and then who never wrote another opera for the remaining 39 years of his life. He had made his fortune, and he chose retirement in Paris and a closer attention to digesting than composing.
Finally, monsieur, a wafer thin mint.
Which, incidentally, is why you can still buy a Tornado Rossini in swanky Paris restaurants today. Rossini fine-dined his way through French restaurants before finally passing away at the ripe old age of 76. Rossini's retirement at 37 really is one of the great mic drop moments in classical music. Contrast that with Vaughn Williams, who composed his Fifth Symphony at the sprightly age of 70. Everyone assumed this would be the great composer's final symphony, his swan song. Only it wasn't his swan song, for some 5 years later, Vaughn Williams composed his Sixth Symphony. And we're not finished there. At 80 years comes his Seventh Symphony, the Antarctica. Still not his last word, as we get an Eighth Symphony from the composer, aged 83, and then an astonishing final Ninth Symphony at the impressive age of 85. So, which of these two versions of old age is more common for a composer? Do they age like a fine wine or like milk? Let's do some comparing. Take films, for example. Film directors seem to get less effective as they enter old age, which isn't surprising when you think about it. As Orson Welles once said, "A writer needs a pen, an artist a brush, but a film director needs an army." As film directors get older, that labour gets harder and harder. So how about painters? Sure, they need a brush, not an army, but they also need their hands and eyes. Which means, as painters age, their work becomes more rough, less finely applied. But composers don't need armies, or even hands. I mean, do they even need their ears? Take the obvious example of Beethoven. He was already experiencing hearing loss in his 20s, but by the time he was in his 40s, he was totally deaf. And yet, his work improved. And I do mean improved. Just look at the end of his life, at the late string quartets, at his late piano works, and his Ninth Symphony. Really, the argument could be made that going deaf improved him. Take, for example, the injection of fugue into his later work, a craft he was still studying into his 50s. Growing old gives you more time to learn, and it seems there's plenty to learn with music. Composers always seem to be improving as they age, even the ones that die relatively young, like Mozart, who was producing some of his finest music in his final year. His string quintet, clarinet concerto, magic flute, the Requiem Mass. Mozart died too young to write his own swan song, but his work was clearly still getting better right up to the end. Classical music's classic swan song comes from Richard Strauss, who composed his beautiful four last songs at the age of 80, a few years before his death. Perhaps my favourite story about the end of a composer's working life concerns J.S. Bach, who was writing The Art of Fugue right up to his death. And I mean right up to his death. You can hear the moment Bach stops working on his manuscript when you listen to the piece. It's chilling. There are, of course, examples like Rossini of composers who stopped working as they got older. Take Sibelius, who effectively stopped composing after his Seventh Symphony in 1924, aged 58. He lived another 30 years in what became known as the silence of Järvenpää. The American composer Charles Ives is another case. Ives stopped composing around 1927, but lived another 27 years. Now, there were health issues tied up with Ives' retirement, and you could make the case that there were mental health issues for the terribly depressive Sibelius. But my final example of non-swan singing has neither excuse. Edward Elgar largely stopped composing after his wife Alice died in 1920, but he lived another 14 years. Elgar was apparently prone to distraction, and that happened much more frequently after his wife's death. That meant Elgar becoming much more interested in horse racing, football and amateur chemistry, but less interested in making music. But these are the exceptions, as most composers seem to not only work into their old age, but whose work seems to actually improve. Think of Tchaikovsky with his Sixth Symphony, premiered days before his death, or Mahler and his mysterious Ninth, which he finished scarcely months before his own death. Old age never really seems to harm a composer's ability to make great art, and very often it seems to help in intensifying his work. Before leaving the subject, I just wanted to point out one composer whose swan songs I would love to have heard. Not Mozart, who had produced so many masterpieces in opera and instrumental music that his early death is maybe a little hard to present as a total tragedy for music. No, I'm talking about Schubert, who died, probably from syphilis, at the unbelievably even younger age of 31, and whose music was seriously improving, and I mean seriously improving, as he aged. Just look at his last year. He had just completed his greatest song cycle, Winterreise, then went on to write not just one of the greatest trios ever written, also one of the largest, having literally 6 months before written another huge one. Then there's the string quintet in C, also phenomenal and colossal. As if all that wasn't enough, his final 3 piano sonatas, which are also each phenomenal and colossal, plus one of the greatest piano duets ever written, the F minor, plus the Fantasy in C, both large plus 20-minute works. Schubert was improving at a startling rate right up until his untimely death. Had he lived another 30 years and continued to improve, well, that's indeed a frightening prospect. I'd say it would be great to hear Schubert's swan song cycle, but of course he actually wrote that in his final year as well. A collection of 14 songs called Swan Song, one of which you're hearing now. Please like and subscribe.
Hörst die Nachtigallen schlagen, ach, sie fliehen dir.